All right, welcome back to day 2. We are going to continue where we left off, but this time we're going to be making a different bread. The bread we're making today is going to be cheese bread. This is the recipe for it. This is the recipe we have on our computer system. And if you download this recipe, it makes 1 pound, so it's for 1 loaf. And one thing to note on this recipe is there's a little box down here for a sponge starter. We have 5 different starters we're going to be working with throughout the course. And the first one we used yesterday, we used Pat Fermentate. And Pat Fermentate is basically just old dough. So that's considered to be one of the 5 starters. A sponge is the next one. And sponges typically have 100% hydration, which means that water and flour are equal parts. So the water weighs the same as the flour. And it usually contains all the yeast in the recipe. And that makes it grow really fast. I've already put together my sponge starter, which in this case calls for 1.5 ounces of bread flour, 1.5 ounces of water, and 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. This is that starter right here, and it's just been growing for about 30 minutes or so. And that will get the yeast kind of kick-started and ready to do its job in the bread. The other thing we want to address here, this is the starter for today. Here's our sourdough starter we started on Monday. And I just put together flour and water. So this is just flour and water. And this morning when I got up, it was already starting to bubble. I was really surprised. So I gave it a mix. I just sort of gave it a stir. The second day of growth, for the second day after mixing, all we have to do is just stir it up. And then we're going to cover it back up again. Tomorrow, when we do our next video, we're going to be going and feeding this. So this is just as I say, flour and water. This was about 2 ounces of flour, 2 ounces of water, and it's already starting to show some growth, which really surprised me, but that's all right. That's good. Growth is good. So we're going to keep this on in storage at room temperature for the time being. Our next video, we're going to feed this, and once we feed it, whatever wild yeast, whatever natural yeast is in the air or was in this flour when it came from the mill, is going to start growing. It's going to, as soon as you feed it, it's going to give it more food, and it's going to start to grow, and we'll be well on our way to starting our sourdough. Sourdough starter usually takes about 5 to 7 days to get started and to really get moving. So after that, throughout this course, we're going to be feeding this sourdough starter. And every time we feed it, it will grow, and we'll then eventually incorporate it in some of our breads. As for the cheese bread, we have the first ingredients here. We have flour. I've also got some yeast in here. I've got 0.04 ounces of yeast. I've also got 0.11 ounces of salt, which is just about 1/8 of an ounce of salt. That's the flour, salt, and yeast in here. Note that I have my salt over here, my yeast over here. I'm not letting the two mix together just yet. Salt in direct contact with yeast will kill the yeast. We don't want that to happen. When it's mixed in with the dough, everything's fine, but salt is too strong for the yeast. And in the world of bread, salt will limit how much the yeast grows. So it's a good thing that it helps to limit that yeast growth. Salt also adds flavor, and it also helps with browning of dough. So we're gonna win in all counts by having some salt in there. The next thing in is the sponge starter. So we're gonna take that sponge starter, and we're just going to put the whole thing in here. This is already pre-mixed. Mixed it about a half an hour ago. And we're just going to go ahead and put that in there. We are also going to then put in our water. Water was 3.92 ounces of water. And we're going to put in a little bit of olive oil. Olive oil just called for 0.67 ounces of olive oil. The olive oil is going to help to retain moisture in the dough, and it's going to make it a much softer bread, I'd say, much softer bread. Now I'm holding off a little bit on the cheese. The cheese here is a mix of cheddar and some Parmesan. I'm going to go ahead and get this dough started, mixing together, and we're just going to get the basic dough to come together as a homogeneous mass. That's all I'm looking to do right now, is just get it together as a homogeneous mass. And like before, I'm going to turn it out onto my board, and do the rest of the kneading by hand on the board. So we're going to go ahead and just turn this out. I'll put this aside for a moment. Notice I'm not putting the cheese in just yet. I don't want to smash the cheese up into a bunch, into a mash that's inside the dough. So I'm going to leave that toward the end and mix it in. Now you can pick your style of mixing, of hand mixing if you like. One thing you'll notice here is as I'm kneading, I am not adding more flour to the bench. If I add more flour, that means I'm adding more flour to the recipe, and I don't want to necessarily do that. I have a certain amount of flour in the recipe already, so I don't want to have extra flour added. It'll make for a dry bread. So as I start to bring this together, and it starts to turn into a dough, and the gluten starts to form, I'm just going to keep kneading for a little bit, and then I'm going to go ahead and add the cheese. Now the thing about this dough is made primarily out of bread flour, so it's not nearly as sticky as our beer bread was. Beer bread got really sticky partially because of all the rye flour in it. So this is starting to come together as a dough. But because it's primarily bread flour, you're getting a much more cohesive gluten structure in this dough. You'll also notice that the board it's cleaning up the board for me. That's something that you usually don't see when you have a lot of rye added to the dough. Rye tends to get a little sticky when it's kneaded. Part of that is the starches in the rye are delicate, and as you knead them, they start to get a little sticky. Okay, so I've got this kind of brought together as a homogeneous mass. I'm just going to throw my cheese in there, and I'm going to work this cheese into the dough. I don't want to lose any of it, so I'm going to get it all back together here. I'm just going to start working it into the dough. I know it looks like a mess. That's okay. Remember, the dough is sticky enough, so it's going to clean up all this stuff and be incorporated all into the dough. So I'm going to start dabbing up ingredients. I just want this cheese to be in the dough. Now another thing I put together here is I've got a little container of cheese here. I'm going to use this as my cheese that I put on top of the dough. This is a great dough. This is cheese bread with cheese in the dough, but we can put cheese on top of the dough as well. So I'm going to do that during the baking process. Okay, so this dough is coming together very nicely. I'm going to put this in an oiled bowl. This dough calls for 2 folds. So we're going to be bulk fermenting this for 30 minutes. Then we're going to fold it. We're going to come back after 30 more minutes and give it another fold. I'm putting a little bit of oil in my bowl just to make sure that the dough doesn't stick to the bowl. Spread it on around. I'll put it in, flip it over, and there's oil on both sides. This is going to sit for 30 minutes. Then we'll fold. Come back 30 minutes later, we'll fold again. And then after that, it has a 15-minute bench rest. So it's a total of 75 minutes of bulk fermentation. So why don't we come back in 30 minutes, we'll take a look at it, we'll give it a fold, and we'll continue from there. Okay, let's go and fold the dough. It's been 30 minutes. This dough has grown a little, but it hasn't really shown an appreciable amount of growth. I'm going to wet my fingers like we did last time. Wet fingers make it a lot easier to fold the dough and hold the dough. But we're going to do a stretch and fold. So we're going to go ahead and stretch and fold from the north, stretch and fold from the south, stretch and fold from the east, and stretch and fold from the west. So north, south, east, and west. What it does, again, is it strengthens that dough. It strengthens that gluten. It's going to also redistribute the yeast, so the yeast will have a brand new environment to feed into. it's going to help degas the dough a little bit, and it's going to help to redistribute the temperature of the dough. The temperature is pretty important because, after all, if the temperature is uneven, some yeast are going to grow fast and some yeast are going to grow slow. So now that we've folded, I'm going to go ahead and cover it up again, another 30 minutes, and we'll be back when it's time to fold again. So why don't we call it until the next time. Okay, time for another fold. Again, wet my fingers and bring this dough out, and we're going to just do the same thing. Stretch and fold, north and over, turn it around, do pull, stretch and fold to the south, go to the other side, east, wet my fingers again, and west. It's getting harder to pull this, I notice. So you see the dough is getting stronger, that gluten is getting stronger. But now that we've done that second fold, back in the bowl, and it's going to get covered. We have to wait now a 15-minute rest, and we'll be ready to shape this dough. All right, 15 minutes is up. Time to pre-shape. Pre-shaping the dough. Notice I have no flour on my board. We're going to pre-shape this dough and just get ready for final shaping and proofing. So I'm going to gently flatten the dough, gently degas the biggest bubbles that are in the dough. And what we're going to do is, in the pre-shaping, we're just going to take everything here from the sides and bring it toward the middle. Then flip it over so we have the pretty side up. And all we're going to do is just sort of drag it along the board a little bit, just to help snug up the exterior. That's what we refer to as a pre-shape for a round loaf. Now, that pre-shape needs to rest for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we're going to tighten it up. Okay, so this had a chance to rest. We're going to go ahead and do the final shaping on this. The dough has rested, and when it rests, it just sort of gets really sort of soft. We're going to go ahead and tighten up this outer skin. The idea of tightening up the outer skin is to make sure that the gases get completely trapped inside the dough and we get a really nice shape for the loaf. We're going to be proofing this in a bowl with a towel. So we're going to be lining this with a towel, flouring the towel, and then putting this in upside down, seam side up, and letting it proof for an hour. It's probably going to be about an hour, maybe two. It does say in the recipe to go until double in bulk, so I'm going to just wait till it fully doubles. But as far as the shaping is concerned, I'm going to go, and we can see what the bottom looks like. I'm going to go ahead and shape this. I'm just going to take my bend scraper and I'm going to bring this along the table, really helping to tighten it up. We can pull it along with our hands. The idea of the table is when we take this and we drag it along the table, the skin gets pulled underneath and it tightens up that skin. That outer skin is, as I say, really important to making sure you have a nice shaping on the loaf. So that is a much tighter, bouncier skin than we had before. I'm going to take this bowl, place the towel inside. I'm going to take a little bit of flour. I'm going to flour the cloth. And I'm going to place this loaf in upside down into the bowl. And this is going to rest now for about an hour, and as I say, maybe two. I'd like to see it rising up so it's double in volume. So I'd like to see it in this bowl. I'd like to see it sort of dome. We're going to go ahead and give that some time to do its thing. Just cover it with plastic. And if you didn't have time to wait around for an hour or two for this to fully proof, one thing that is an option with this bread, and it doesn't mention it in the recipe, is that we could put it in the refrigerator and let it sit overnight. If we were to let it proof overnight in the refrigerator, it would double in volume overnight. And then we could bring it out, bring it up to room temperature, and we could then bake that off. But if you have the time, just do it here at room temperature. We're going to let this sit, and we will come back and see how the loaf looks and get ready to throw it in the oven. Okay, so here we go. We've got our bread going. Our dough has been rising now. It's been proofing for about 2 hours. And this has been at room temperature, and it's kind of cold and rainy out today, so it's kind of chilly in the house, but the dough has come up really nice. I'm going to transfer this out of this bowl onto my sheet pan. Now I've just got a little half sheet pan here, but any cookie sheet would do the trick. I'm just going to hold back my towel, and I'm going to dump this out onto the paper. As you can see, it just comes right up. And it has risen up quite a bit. It has really come up a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and put some extra cheese on here as well. And I just got to, I found this edge on this this spreader to be pretty sharp. So I'm going to use this to score the loaf. I'm not going to score it really detailed, but I think this will do the trick. You can really use a sharp paring knife or really anything with a good sharp edge. I'm just going to do a quick slice this way, quick slice that way, this way, and that way. Just a couple of scores to allow it to expand in the oven as it grows. And I'm going to pour some cheese right on top of this. I do suggest that you have something underneath it, paper, foil, something. If you're going to use foil, I would probably dust it with flour before you go and put it in the oven so that it won't stick to the foil. But I also found that I could go to the supermarket and get a roll of parchment paper, and that worked out just fine. So this is going in at 400 degrees. The recipe originally calls for putting it in at 425 for the first 10 minutes and then dropping your oven temperature down to 400. You can follow the recipe and that'll work just fine. I just thought I'm going to go ahead and set it at 400, and I'm going to do it for about 25 to 30 minutes. It should get good and golden brown, and we should be able to have a nice loaf of bread. So when we come back, it'll be this will be done. You'll be able to see the final result. Okay, so here's our finished loaf of bread. This got really nicely baked. It came out just fine from the oven. Still pretty hot. And as we talked about with the last bread, it's got to cool first. Give it a good chance to cool before you try cutting into it. But this is our result of our single loaf of cheese bread. As I said, tomorrow we're going to do another video. I'm bringing back my sourdough, and this little sourdough starter here has just been flour and water for 2 days, and tomorrow we're going to feed it. So when we feed it, it should grow even more. It's already growing a little bit. Just sitting for a couple of days, flour and water, it starts to grow on its own. Anyway, we're going to call it a day, and I hope your cheese bread comes out just as well as mine did. And when you get your loaf done, make sure to shoot a picture of it and upload it to the talent system so we can all take a look at what your work looks like. We'll see you tomorrow.